The summer of 1941 was supposed to be Germany's season of triumph. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June, had promised quick victories and the destruction of the Soviet Union before the first snow fell. By September, the Wehrmacht had indeed marched deep into Soviet territory. Cities had burned, entire armies had been shattered, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners marched westward under German guard. Yet what appeared to be unstoppable momentum was already showing cracks. 11 weeks of relentless campaigning had drained the Wehrmacht's strength. Soldiers who had once believed they would be home by Christmas now realized they were locked in a struggle unlike anything Europe had seen before. In the north, the city of Leningrad had been surrounded. Its proud streets and ancient neighborhoods were cut off from the outside world, condemned to face one of the most infamous sieges in history. In the south, German panzers under Guderian and Kleist were driving relentlessly, seeking to meet behind the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. If they succeeded, the entire Soviet Southwestern Front, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, would be trapped in a deadly pocket. In the center, near Smolensk, the Red Army hammered the German lines, buying precious time with blood and sacrifice. Everywhere along the 1,000-mile front, battles raged, but the German army was not the same force that had crossed the Soviet frontier in June. The price of victory was enormous. By the end of September, German casualties were reported at over 500,000 men. 14 divisions were missing more than 4,000 men each, while dozens more were dangerously undertaken. Tanks and artillery had been lost in staggering numbers, nearly 1,500 gone since June, roughly a third of the initial armored force. On paper, Hitler still commanded the most formidable army in the world. In reality, his divisions were stretched thin, fighting on broken machines, and waiting desperately for reinforcements that never came in time. Even as German soldiers struggled, Hitler's ambitions only grew. He ordered new panzer divisions to be created in Germany, instead of replenishing the battered units in the field. When General Halder finally convinced him to release replacements, the numbers were pitiful. Fewer than 100 tanks had reached the front by early September, a fraction of what was needed. Many of these were older models, including Panzer I, as that had been outdated since the campaign in France. The German armored spearhead was still deadly, but it was no longer invincible. Still, the Wehrmacht pressed on. They had little choice. Hitler demanded victory at any cost. To his commanders, Moscow still loomed as the ultimate prize. But before that, Kyiv had to be taken, and Leningrad crushed. The Germans were exhausted, their strength bleeding away with every mile. Yet the Soviet Union was also reeling, collapsing under the weight of disaster after disaster. Both armies were staggering forward, like two fighters in a ring, battered but unwilling to fall. The stage was set for one of the most devastating encirclements in history. On September 8, 1941, the trap around Leningrad slammed shut. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, completed the encirclement of the Soviet Union's second-largest city. For the citizens of Leningrad, it was the beginning of nearly 900 days of horror. For the Germans, it was supposed to be a swift and decisive victory. Hitler had ordered that the city was not to be stormed, but starved. He wanted Leningrad to vanish from the map, its people left to die behind a wall of German troops and artillery. To carry this out, Lieb's army cut all land connections to the city, aiming to sever supply lines across Lake Ladoga as well. The defenders inside the city numbered nearly 500,000 regular troops, reinforced by 3 divisions of hastily organized people's militia. Men, women, and even teenagers were armed and thrown onto the defensive lines. The Soviet Baltic Fleet, anchored in the city's harbor, brought its heavy guns to bear, firing thousands of shells in support of the defenders. The Germans unleashed a brutal bombardment. Heavy artillery, including massive siege guns, pounded the city's defenses. Luftwaffe bombers darkened the skies, raining destruction on factories, homes, and food depots. One raid set fire to the Badiv warehouses, which stored much of Leningrad's food supply. The flames consumed tons of grain and sugar, plunging the city into the abyss of famine before the siege had even fully begun. Hunger quickly spread, and within weeks, bread rations dropped to near starvation levels. Despite this, the Soviet defenders fought with astonishing resilience. German attempts to break through at Krasnoe and Krasnoe Selo were met with fierce artillery fire from land and sea. Naval brigades, workers, militias, and regular Red Army units fought side by side, stopping the German advance just short of the city itself. By mid-September, German forces had seized key positions but lacked the reinforcements to finish the job. Hitler, obsessed with Moscow, ordered divisions stripped from Lieb's army and sent south. The Germans had surrounded Leningrad, but they did not have the strength to crush it quickly. The people of the city would now endure the unendurable. Starvation, disease, and ceaseless bombardment became daily life. Yet, under the leadership of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who arrived in mid-September, Leningrad's defenses stiffened. Stalin's no-step-back orders meant retreat was no longer an option. For the Soviet Union, holding Leningrad was a matter of survival, not just military, but psychological. The siege had begun, and neither side could yet imagine the suffering it would unleash. While the siege of Leningrad tightened, the German 41st Corps prepared for one more attempt to break the Soviet lines southwest of the city. Their target was Krasnoe and Krasnoe Selo strongpoints, protecting the approaches to Leningrad. If they fell, German armor could push deeper, perhaps even into the city itself. On September 9th, the attack began. At first it seemed as if the German motorized infantry would succeed. Spearheaded by the 36th Motorized Division, the assault penetrated nearly 10 kilometers, scattering Soviet defenders. But almost immediately, the Red Army struck back. A massive artillery barrage shook the ground, followed by counterattacks from the 42nd Army. Naval gunfire from the Baltic Fleet hammered German positions. The once confident advance bogged down into brutal close-quarter fighting. The Germans committed the 1st Panzer Division to renew the assault. Tanks rumbled forward through fields churned to mud by constant shell fire. They gained ground, forcing Soviet defenders to fall back from several fortified villages. Yet the cost was steep. Soviet counterattacks, often led by hastily raised People's Militia, were suicidal but relentless. Entire battalions of workers, sailors, and students charged German positions, sometimes armed with little more than rifles or grenades. They were mown down in horrific numbers. But their sacrifice slowed the German momentum. By September 12th, both sides were throwing in their last reserves. The Soviets committed a naval infantry brigade and the newly formed 5th People's Militia Division. Despite their inexperience, they fought with fanatical determination. Krasnoe Selo finally fell to the Germans, and Krasnogardetsky was outflanked. Yet the city of Pulkovo held firm, blocking the road north. Victory was within Lieb's grasp, but it was slipping away. Hitler ordered the 41st Corps, his offensive spearhead, transferred south to Army Group Center, in good condition. Lieb was forced to weaken his lines just as the Soviet 54th Army began attacking his flanks from the east. Reinhardt, commanding the 41st, begged for one final chance. He launched one last assault before redeploying. Gains were made, but at terrible cost, and the chance to storm Leningrad evaporated. For the Red Army, the battle was a narrow escape. The city still starved under siege, but the Germans had failed to break in. For the Wehrmacht, it was a warning. The Red Army would not collapse as easily as France had in 1940. Even when poorly armed, poorly trained, and outnumbered, Soviet soldiers, sound civilians, would fight to the death for their homeland. As the battle raged outside Leningrad, inside the city, a dramatic change was underway. Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, one of Stalin's most trusted but outdated commanders, had failed to organize an effective defense. His plan to demolish Leningrad military facilities was reckless, and his inability to inspire confidence alarmed Moscow. Stalin summoned him back to report in person and, in his place, he sent the man who was quickly becoming his most ruthless fixer, Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov had already proven himself during the defense of Moscow earlier in the war. Now, he was tasked with saving Leningrad. Upon arrival, he immediately cancelled Voroshilov's plans to destroy military assets. Instead, he issued a brutal order. There would be no retreat, no surrender, no step back. Commanders were warned that withdrawal, even for tactical reasons, would mean execution. Stalin's infamous stand-or-die mentality was now embodied in Zhukov's leadership. But Zhukov was more than just a disciplinarian. He understood that the defense of Leningrad had to be organized in depth. He set about building a second defensive line stretching from the Gulf of Finland to the Neva River. He ordered civilians into militias, organized workers into construction brigades, and transformed the city itself into a fortress. Trenches, bunkers, and barricades were dug in parks and squares. Civilians who had never held a weapon were handed rifles and told to stand beside regular soldiers. When the Germans struck again, Zhukov was ready. The 41st Corps attacked with tanks and infantry, supported by artillery and Luftwaffe bombers. They made gains, seizing Uritsk and reaching the Gulf of Finland by September 16th. isolating a Soviet force in the Oranienbaum bridgehead. Yet they could go no further. Soviet defenders fought ferociously, counterattacking whenever a breakthrough seemed likely. Naval brigades and militia divisions absorbed staggering losses but bought time for Zhukov to stabilize his lines. By mid-September, the German offensive had stalled. Leningrad was cut off, but it would not fall. Zhukov's arrival had transformed despair into defiance. The siege would last years, but the city's survival in those crucial weeks was due largely to his ruthless energy and organizational genius. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had failed to deliver the knockout blow it promised. Hitler's gamble in the north had turned into a war of attrition he had never wanted. While Leningrad endured, the German Army Group Center experienced a rare lull. Its forces had been bloodied at Smolensk and Yelnya, suffering thousands of casualties. Now they prepared for the next great offensive, Operation Typhoon. The drive on Moscow. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, spent September locked in arguments with OKH, the German High Command. He wanted reinforcements, fuel, and artillery ammunition for the decisive strike on the Soviet capital. Instead, Hitler kept pulling divisions away to support operations in the north and south. Still, Bock clung to the hope that soon he would be unleashed toward Moscow. On the front lines, the fighting never fully stopped. Soviet forces launched small but relentless attacks, often preceded by hours of artillery barrages. German soldiers, rationed on shells for weeks, were astonished at the Red Army's seemingly endless supply of ammunition. The Soviets were bleeding themselves dry, but they kept the pressure on, preventing the Germans from fully regrouping. Despite the Soviet assaults, there was no real threat of a breakthrough. The front was holding, but beneath the surface, exhaustion gnawed at both sides. The German divisions were understrength, many fighting at less than half capacity. Soviet units were equally depleted, relying on fresh recruits with minimal training to fill the gaps. Both armies were burning themselves out, but neither could stop. Bock and his generals knew that the fate of the war rested on Moscow. Yet, as they waited, the focus of both Hitler and Stalin shifted southward to Kyiv. What happened there in September would reshape the entire war on the Eastern Front on Ukraine. Disaster was looming. German panzer groups under Guderian and were maneuvering to trap the Soviet Southwestern Front near Kyiv. Soviet generals saw the danger clearly. They begged Stalin to authorize a withdrawal before it was too late. Marshal Shaposhnikov and his deputy Vasilevsky argued with the Soviet dictator directly. They warned him that hundreds of thousands of men were at risk. But Stalin was immovable. Kyiv, he declared, could not be abandoned. It was the third largest city in the Soviet Union, rich in history and morale value. To give it up without a fight would be politically catastrophic. There were other reasons for his stubbornness. Stalin was desperate to prove to Britain and the United States that the USSR was still a worthy ally. He feared that retreating from Kyiv would make the Soviet Union look weak and discourage aid. He also believed, wrongly, that Guderian's southward move was only a fainter prelude to an attack on Moscow. Permission for even limited withdrawals was given only after endless pleading. The 5th and 37th Armies were allowed to fall back slightly, but the larger Southwestern Front was ordered to hold firm. Stalin's will condemned them to disaster. On September 7th, Guderian's armor punched through Soviet lines. Mud and rain slowed his advance, but the Red Army was too weak to stop him. General Andriy Eremenko, placed in command of the Bryansk front, tried desperately to resist, but his forces were shattered, communication collapsed, and his counterattacks bled away what little striking power he had left. Still, Stalin placed his faith in him, ignoring the warnings of other officers. The jaws of the trap were closing. By clinging to Kyiv, Stalin had set the stage for one of the greatest encirclements in military history. As September wore on, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group lunged southward. His forces were stretched thin, some divisions defending frontages of over 90 kilometers. Yet they pushed relentlessly forward. At Romny, on September 10th, General Model's 3rd Panzer Division captured a massive Soviet supply depot. It was a stroke of luck that saved the offensive. His tanks were nearly out of fuel. At the same time, Klist's Panzer Group prepared to cross the Dnieper near Krasnoe. The crossing was delayed for days as infantry corps struggled to secure Britain. But when the panzers finally surged across on September 12th, they smashed through the Soviet 38th Army. Villages fell in hours. Divisions collapsed in days. Klist's tanks pushed toward Lubny, meeting only scattered resistance from NKVD units. Militia and anti-aircraft batteries pressed into ground combat. By September 13th, panic spread across the Soviet Southwestern Front. Communication broke down, commanders lost contact with their armies, and whole divisions disintegrated. Soviets' counterattacks, poorly coordinated and poorly equipped, achieved little. Even attempts to flank German spearheads, with the few remaining tanks, ended in disaster. Model's men dug in, waiting desperately for Kleiss's panzers to link up. On September 15th, the trap finally closed. German armor met at Lukovice, cutting off the Soviet Southwestern Front from the east. Kyiv was surrounded, and the greatest encirclement of the Second World War was complete. The encirclement at Kyiv was a catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale. More than 600,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped in the pocket. Entire armies ceased to exist. Out of 261,000 men committed to halting Guderian, nearly 100,000 were casualties, and the rest marched into captivity. Tank divisions, rifle divisions, artillery corps all swallowed whole. Breakout attempts were desperate and chaotic. Supply troops, armed with rifles and without heavy weapons, charged German panzer lines in suicidal assaults. Some columns managed to surprise isolated German units, even overrunning a Panzer Corps command post at one point. But these victories were fleeting. Without coordination or support, they collapsed under German counterattacks. Inside the pocket, confusion reigned. Soviet commanders tried to rally their men, but orders from Stalin still insisted on holding Kyiv. Every day of delay condemned more men to encirclement. By the time Stalin finally admitted the scale of the disaster, it was too late. For the Germans, Kyiv was the greatest victory of the campaign. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners, vast stockpiles of weapons and equipment, and the destruction of entire Soviet fronts seemed to confirm the invincibility of the Wehrmacht. Hitler boasted that the Soviet Union was finished. Yet beneath the triumph, his army was bleeding. Divisions were under strength, tanks were worn out, and the endless Russian distances still stretched ahead. For the Soviets, the loss was staggering, but not fatal. Stalin's refusal to retreat had cost him dearly, but the Soviet Union still had men, still had factories, and still had the will to fight. Kyiv was a disaster, but it was not the end. The Eastern Front was only beginning. What followed would be even bloodier, even more desperate, as two exhausted giants staggered toward the next round of battles. Leningrad starved, Moscow awaited its fate, and the world watched to see if the Soviet Union could survive the storm. And so, as history's greatest land war unfolded, the question remained: how many more disasters could the Red Army endure before the tide finally turned?